In a world drowning in data, open source intelligence is the difference between noise and insight. I'm Jake Krebs, and this is the OSINT Podcast, unpacking the tools, tactics, and techniques that matter to the OSINT community. Whether you're tracking threats, analyzing platforms, or just trying to separate signal from noise, this is your go-to resource for all things open source intelligence. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome to the 7th episode of the OSINT Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Krebs, and in today's episode, we're going to be covering two different issues of the OSINT Newsletter. If you aren't already subscribed to the OSINT Newsletter, head on over to osintnewsletter.com and subscribe. If you wanted to follow along with today's episode, go ahead and head on over to osintnewsletter.com/84 for the first half of this episode, and then /85 for the second half of this episode. Additionally, if you aren't already following us on social media, go ahead and head on over to X or LinkedIn, search for the OSINT Newsletter and the OSINT Podcast, and follow us there. All right, issue number 84 of the OSINT Newsletter is specifically designed for beginner investigators. And this is part of an ongoing series we have that covers more beginner content and not necessarily the super advanced technical stuff that we find in the normal iteration of the OSINT Newsletter. And the topic for this particular issue is username search. Now, many of you who are intermediate or advanced investigators, you often use usernames very regularly as your initial touch point for finding profiles online. Every single social media platform, for the most part, can be found by connecting a username to a specific profile. So whether you're on Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, everybody who has a profile has a username. And once you have a username, you can use a variety of different tools, tactics, and techniques to be able to gather more information about that username and the profiles that are associated with it. In this issue number 84, the high-level summary is just the different username search tools that are available, the username variations that you can get based on what you know about the person, and then pivoting once you find a profile that matches the person that you're looking for, followed by a case study, which is probably better if you read it, and then key takeaways just to make sure that everything is tied together. So the first thing that I wanted to do before moving on, though, is mention what we covered in the last episode of the OSINT Podcast and the OSINT Newsletter. So one of the things that I was really excited about in the last episode and the last issue was the content within issue number 83, which is monitoring live webcams in a single pane of glass. In that issue, I showed how I built a tool to be able to take a variety of different live webcams, put them into a single pane of glass, and then use a variety of different features that I built into the app to be able to explore that information further. So rather than having to monitor a bunch of different tabs of a bunch of different webcams that were showing a live event, I could monitor them all in a single pane of glass. I could geolocate them. I could write metadata notes, and I could continue my investigation without taking my eyes off of any particular camera. Whether you prefer to read or to listen, the content was covered in both different areas. So go ahead and head on over to osintnewsletter.com/83 if you want to read, or episode 6 called The Spectrum of OSINT if you prefer to listen. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get started into issue number 84, talking about usernames. So the first thing to consider when you're wanting to use username tools, which is probably the most efficient way to navigate username searches, because you can manually go in and go to instagram.com/username, whatever. It's going to be very time consuming if you want to do that one by one. So there's a variety of different tools that are out there that you can use. If you prefer to use a web app, a user interface on your browser, tools like What's My Name are probably going to be better suited for you. whatsmyname.app would be the URL if you're interested. If you want to use more CLI tools, you're probably looking at something like Sherlock or Magret, I think is how you pronounce it, or even tools like Blackbird if you want to use an open source tool on GitHub. And it's actually pretty cool. We'll talk about this later in the podcast about how you can maybe take those tools that you prefer in the CLI and maybe make a user interface around them so you can get the best of both worlds. But a little bit more on that later. So the first thing you want to do is find what your ideal toolkit is and find the things that work for you. And what I mentioned in previous podcast iterations is don't put all your eggs in one basket. You want to make sure you have 1, 2, maybe 3 tools that you like the best. Keep them in your tool belt and then use your primary unless anything goes wrong with it, and then make sure you have a backup of a secondary and tertiary in the event that you run into any problems. So that's what the first part of this issue talks about. There's a bunch of different links and different things you want to check out in that first section, but pick your tool set, find what works for you, make sure that you're using it early and often. The next thing that it talks about is username variations. And this is where there's some nuance here. There's a little bit of guess and check if you want to really, use this method. And oftentimes you have a username like John Smith, no spaces, just the first two names. But it could be a very common username. It could be used by a variety of different people. So oftentimes the username's not available for somebody if they want to register a new profile. In the event that that happens, there's a variety of different iterations that you should try. Instead of John Smith, you should try J Smith. And maybe instead of John Smith, you want to try John S, for example. Very, very basic examples. Another thing too is people oftentimes put their birth date or their birth year in their email address, and oftentimes the email address that's used to register for an account will automatically take the username from the email and apply it by default to the profile. And many people don't change that username. So if your email is johnsmith98@gmail.com, your username may be automatically set to johnsmith98. So if you know the birth year of the individual, or maybe even the birth date and year, you want to make sure that you add that on there in the event that you find a duplicate profile. The next thing, and I'm not going to cover all of these, just a few other things that are called out from this issue, is if you have a specific location, think area codes for phone numbers, zip codes, things like that. Tack those onto the end or beginning of a username. Sometimes people who really identify with a location will put, John Smith, 528 next to it, if that is the area code of the region that they're in. So those are some things to think about. Make sure you're not just sticking with the username that you find, that you add a little bit of creativity, take other information you might know, apply it to the username. Once you find a hit, let's say you get lucky, you find a hit, you can add that to your username search tooling and be able to find other profiles that have a similar username in the event that, let's say, their email address applies that username by default across a variety of different profiles that they have registered to. The next thing that this issue covers is pivoting. Right? Let's say you put in a username into a username search tool. You get 15 different matches. 11 of them are correct. You pivot into those profiles. You have sock puppets set up. Make sure you're not leaving any, breadcrumbs to make sure that you can't be traced back to the investigation. You find what you're looking for. You find images, first and last names, maybe even email addresses, phone numbers that are listed on the profile. These are where you can get higher fidelity results by using these inside of other types of different OSINT tools. If you find a phone number, for example, you can add those into OSINT tools to get more exact matching versus username, which is it's a lesser confidence match because anybody can use a username, whereas things like email addresses and phone numbers are a little bit more unique identifiers. The whole goal with this username search methodology is to make sure you find the profiles, you pivot to something a little bit more reliable, and then you continue your investigation from there. So you want to be finding things like emails, phone numbers as originally stated, but also images now. You can do reverse image search. You can use facial recognition search engines. You can use all these different data points to continue to extrapolate your investigation. And let's say that you find an image, you reverse the image, you find a different profile. It has a different username than the one you originally started with. You add that to your list, you put it back in the username search tools, you continue to iterate until you exhaust all of your resources. Then you take all the information that you've collected and begin to do your analysis. And maybe you add on some more collection later on once you do a little bit more analysis, but you do want to find a stopping point where you're like, hey, I found 23 profiles, I have a ton of images, I have phone numbers, I have email addresses, I have a variety of usernames. Now it's time to actually investigate the content within these profiles, not just continuously look for new profiles to find. So that's where that section is covering. From there, there's a case study. That's the 44-year-old meme lord. It's something that you definitely want to check out. OSINT God 69 is the name of the username. There's a quick little case study here to follow along if you're new to open source intelligence and you want to do a little bit of a canned investigation. So that's it for issue number 84. Once again, OSINTnewsletter.com/84. If you're a newer investigator, it's definitely worth checking out. And this is part of an ongoing series, so every other newsletter will be free. It'll be targeted towards beginner investigators. If you like this one, go ahead and also check out OSINT Newsletter issue number 82. You can check that out, OSINTnewsletter.com/82. All right, now let's start talking about issue number 85 of the OSINT newsletter. This is your typical newsletter I've been putting out for years, where I have 6 different topics, 3 areas of OSINT news that's worth covering, as well as 3 new tools to check out to enhance your workflow. Let's start with the tools section. The first thing that I wanted to call out may seem like a repeat from a previous issue or episode of the podcast, but it is actually something that's new. But Justin Charters, which I mentioned before, talks about more OSINT tips for China. And in this particular case, it is 7 different areas that you can add to your investigative workflow to make sure that you are not just relying on keyword searches or anything like that if you're trying to investigate any type of content around China. So in this particular case, he says, let's say that you've been asked to review and analyze the geopolitical impact of the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive infrastructure project to connect global trade routes back to China. He then gives 7 tips on how you could actually go about collecting information about this. One of the things that he mentioned is making sure that you get a list of all the key Chinese news sites reporting on the issue. Now, there's a variety of other tools that are out there you can use to augment this, to be able to automatically translate the Mandarin into English or whatever your native language is. But definitely want to make sure that you grab news sites. And not only the news sites, but if you can find RSS feeds for those news sites, that's going to be even better, because you can automate the collection of all the content that they're putting out and then pipe that content directly into some type of translation service to make sure that it's in your language that you understand. The next thing he mentions is following organizations outside of China that are supporting the project or working as partners. This is where it gets a little bit more difficult. You have to get, your hands dirty a little bit. You got to do the investigation to find out all the different vendors, suppliers, and all the different people that are actually carrying out the Belt and Road Initiative. Get all of their social media profiles and all of their news publications or wherever they're putting content out, and add that into your collection pool as well. On top of that, like I already mentioned, look for Belt and Road social media groups and online communities. These aren't just people that are actually initiating any action on behalf of the Belt and Road Initiative. It could also be any type of watchdogs or any type of people that are specifically reporting on the Belt and Road social media or the Belt and Road Initiative. And you can often find ways to pull all that information out of social media and find it and sort of aggregate it with other types of tools that you have for the news sites that you're monitoring. Then, like I mentioned early on, finding keywords like the memorandum of understanding with China and the Belt and Road. Sometimes you can't just put Belt and Road in your queries and always expect to get good results. You need to find adjacent and alike keywords that you can use to monitor. And then what you can do is you can start with a large list, and then you can start to add sort of a deny list to make sure that you're not just getting tons of false positives, but you're also getting valuable content. And this is one of the things that this next point that I really enjoy and that I specifically call out in the newsletter is make a list of every infrastructure company in China that does overseas business and monitor their news and social media feeds. So sometimes it's not just them talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, but just really anything that they're up to. If you really want to be an investigator and start connecting the dots, you can start collecting all this content and start reading between the lines a little bit. There are 2 other points that he calls out here. I won't specifically call these out, but there is a variety of different Chinese social media sites that you can go to start collecting information on, whether it's Baidu, Weibo, whatever you have access to or have sock puppets set up for. You want to make sure that you set those up as well. He also talks about a Chinese equivalent of the website Quora, where people ask a lot of questions and get answers from either experts or people who claim to be experts. A lot of times there's information that can be collected there that might be relevant for your investigation. So definitely go ahead and check that out. If you head on over to OSINTnewsletter.com/85, go on over to the OSINT news section, check out the first one that's called OSINT Tips for China. I have a link that pivots you over to LinkedIn where he posts a little bit more about that. All right, moving on to the second topic, which is actually an OPSEC related thing. It's not really open source intelligence related, but it's something that I think is worth calling out just to make sure that you're being safe while conducting investigations online. And and that's titled DHS Ordered OpenAI to Share User Data in the First Known Warrant for ChatGPT Prompts. Now, I won't go into tons of details about this. It's just a general OPSEC reminder that you should not be using a ChatGPT account that is associated with your own personal information if you're using it for open source intelligence investigations. There's been a lot of people that keep pushing more and more folks towards using AI with OSINT investigations, and I think that's totally fine. It allows you to be incredibly efficient. I talk about it in this newsletter and in this podcast all the time, but you want to make sure you're keeping good OPSEC, and this is a good reminder for that. If law enforcement can request these records from ChatGPT and get the specific prompts of individuals, it's not really clear whether or not, other foreign governments will be, requesting the same thing for ChatGPT, whether they're going to comply or not. And the last thing that you want to do is have your prompts that are related specifically to an open source intelligence investigation connected to your real world identity and pulled into some sort of massive data gathering initiative where you may be revealed as somebody who might be involved in an investigation. So definitely go ahead and give that a read, and just keep that in mind that ChatGPT, similar to social media accounts, you should be using a sock puppet there if you're using it for OSINT investigations. All right, the next thing that I want to talk about is an interesting article that I read that talks about how open source intelligence, while I usually talk about it as a force for good, and many of the folks that I work with often use it, as a source of good, whether looking for missing persons, trying to counter child exploitation, law enforcement investigations into criminals, things like that. There's also the dark side of OSINT, and people using publicly available information or using methods to find harder information to find, and using that for bad reasons. And this article that was written by the Global Network on Extremism and Technology talks about those things. It gives a couple different case studies, and one of these things, for example, I will mention, it said, on the 20th of March, 2024, 3 British men set fire to a warehouse in East London that stored Starlink satellite terminals bound for Ukraine. UK prosecutors later revealed that the arsonists had been guided by Russia's Wagner Group, which crowdsourced reconnaissance via a Telegram bot. 5 days before the attack, a Wagner-linked handler on Telegram provided the men with satellite images and other OSINT data points of the target site. The attackers would later carry out the arson, causing roughly £1 million in damage. Let that set in for a second. Whether we're talking about things like swatting, stalking, or in this case, arson, people that are trying to use open source intelligence for good reasons, they can use this information as well. They can use satellite imagery, they can use open source intelligence tools, they can turn IPs into identities, whatever. But people that are trying to do it for bad reasons, they can use them too. And this is something to keep in mind when you're building capabilities and putting them out there in the the World Wide Web, is that you may be just publishing a cool tool to GitHub and hoping that other ethical OSINT investigators will be using it in their workflow, but they could also be added for bad reasons. And you want to make sure that you're not really being irresponsible with the capabilities, or whether it's a tool or just research about methodologies. You want to make sure you're not opening it up to too wide of an audience. I suspect that for many reasons, this is why the open source intelligence community is kind of closed up a little bit. When I first started getting involved in these things, maybe almost 10 years ago now, everything was public. There was like really weird tools that you could use to stalk people, and there was really weird articles online about people finding their girlfriends from 10 years ago and things like that. And I think a lot of that's closed up now. Some of it, I think, is just the openly available information is becoming so vast that it's requiring so much technology just to gather all the information. That technology costs a lot of money, and so people have to charge enterprise, price figures to be able to, keep these things up and running. But I also think to a certain extent, there's been enough bad case studies of this information being used badly that a lot of people are a little bit cagey in releasing some of this information online. You definitely see that on GitHub with the available tools that are out there. You also see that with the lack of social media interaction that you used to see on OSINT related topics on places like X, LinkedIn, etc. So definitely worth reading this article if you want a reminder about OSINT and ethics. It's a pretty long read, but I think it's worth checking out, especially if you are in the academic space or you're in the regulatory space and you're thinking about how this information can be used for the wrong reasons. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the tools section. There are 3 different tools that I want to cover. The first one is the breached forms database search. Now, I really like this tool because this is one of the rare tools that's like, wow, I haven't seen this before. And what this does is it allows you to do a username search into a database. Now here I'm just going to do John Smith and see what comes up. When I checked this earlier, and I have this pulled up here, there's a variety of different fields that come up, but just under the basic information, right? I'm seeing an email address that was used. It kind of looks like gibberish. So somebody's maybe using good OPSEC, maybe the admins are obfuscating the emails. But you have the last IP geolocation. Ireland, for example, is where the last IP was used. If you put in another one, I'm just going to say, let's do Jane Smith or Jane Doe. I'll use Jane Doe. They use an actual Gmail account, for example, and it was registered in the Russian Federation, including 2 different IP addresses that were associated with the account. So what does this mean? This means that if a forum goes down, like breach forums in this case, there are tools that can be created and exist to archive these things so that you can continue to investigate historical behavior and find information about, oftentimes, our malicious users online. These are people who sell leaked data, sell exploits, sell a variety of nefarious tooling or data sources that are often used for bad. And in many cases, it could be people that just registered for accounts, but we're just browsing and viewing. I talked a little bit earlier about username searches and how to pivot and find additional information. This is one of those tools you want to add to your toolkit. If you're doing a username search, you find a variety of hits. All of those hits are the same person, similar accounts, similar names, similar images. Run that same username into this breach form database search and see if you can find any corroborating evidence. You might be able to find an email address, which is a good pivot point. You might be able to find a location, which is also supplemental information, or maybe an IP address that matches something else that you have before. So definitely worth checking out. It's free, doesn't cost any money. It's very easy to use. Once you get to the search results page, it's a little bit difficult to navigate. There's a bunch of different fields and you have to expand them all. They probably could do a better job at visualizing that data after the search, but it is a treasure trove of information depending on who you're looking for. All right, the next one on the list is called GeoVLM. And I mentioned in the past about how you can use a tool called GeoIntel to use Gemini to do a geolocation-based search. You give it an image, it does a rough approximation of where that image might be in the world, and then you can maybe narrow down the scope of your investigation. Instead of looking at the whole planet, you can look at just a specific subset of the world. The problem with the GeoIntel tool is it's kind of a pain in the butt to get set up. You needed I think you needed an API key. You needed to configure the tool. You needed to download all the dependencies. Not very user-friendly for many people that are getting into open source intelligence. And some people, even if they've been in the industry for a while, they don't want to use command line tools. One, their enterprise machine might not allow them. And 2, they just never really used it because they've been used to the enterprise tools that are all based in the browser. If you use GeoVLM, which is hosted on Hugging Face, which if you're not familiar with Hugging Face, it's just a place where you can find tons of data sources that are nowadays being primarily used to train LLMs. But this is actually a tool built on top of Hugging Face that allows you to just drop an image into the tool called GeoVLM, and it'll do the geolocation based on the AI prediction. So if you want to try geolocation with AI, and you want something that isn't generic, like something generic would be ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever. You want something that's specifically tailored to geolocation, go ahead and give this a try. I have a link in it in OSINT Newsletter, issue number 85, the second one on the list. Upload the image, find the results, no scripts, no paywalls, just results. Once again, don't rely on it as an exact geolocation. There's always a chance that there's going to be a false positive. It is a way for you to narrow your investigation to a specific source or a specific area and then determine whether or not it's true or false, right? It says it's in Europe. Let's find out if it's in Europe. It says it's specifically in France. Let's see if it's in France. Instead of saying, where on earth could this be? Let's narrow it down. Let's try to do all these different manual investigative methods. Start here, start with the tool, confirm or deny. If it's not correct, then go back to the drawing board. This will save you a ton of time. All right, the last tool on the list is called Web Recon. And this is mostly for penetration testers or cybersecurity professionals. And the toolkit is primarily meant for things like web crawling and data extraction, finding out the technology stack of a website, for example. Are they running WordPress? Are they running, a variety of different plugins, things like that? Harvesting emails from a website, doing some DNS intelligence and who is lookup to see if we can find any information about who owns the domain, maybe even historical analysis using the Wayback Machine, and then getting a report on that. Now, some of those things may not be only for penetration testers or cybersecurity folks. They could also be for just general open source intelligence investigators, whether you're doing people search, you're in law enforcement, whatever. The main areas to take away from this, if you aren't doing cybersecurity related work, the email harvesting is going to be really helpful. If you go to a website and you just want to pull every single email address on the site off of there, this will iterate through all the pages, pull out all the emails, dump them in your report. If you're trying to figure out who's behind the domain, this is going to have built-in DNS intelligence, who is lookup. It's going to be basic. It's not going to be anything enterprise, and it's probably not going to be leveraging a really robust data set, but it's a good place to start. And then finally, the Wayback Machine. This is useful for everybody. It's going to find all the different historical links for the website that you're looking for and allows you to easily pivot to those to see if there's earlier iterations that might have more information available. So definitely check it out. It's another OSINT multi-tool. It's not very unique. There's many of these out here, but a lot of times these multi-tools aren't updated. This one has recently been published. So if you're having issues, and like I mentioned before, you want a redundancy of several different multi-tools if you have them, add this one to your list. If you like it, put it on the top of your list. If you don't like it, put it somewhere in the middle of the list. If your other tools go down, they're not being updated, something's breaking, go ahead and use this one instead. So that's it for the free portion of the OSINT newsletter, issue number 85. Once again, head on over OSINT Newsletter /85 and subscribe. Now I'm going to be pivoting to what's behind the paywall, and this is specifically contributing to free OSINT tools using AI. Now, I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, and I'll mention it again, which is a lot of times you have a command line interface tool that you find on GitHub, but you have problems with it. Let's say that you're running into bugs. The documentation doesn't make any sense. Maybe you want a user interface for it instead of a CLI tool, right? These are all problems that are very difficult human problems to solve. Debugging a script, getting it to work, updating the documentation, building a user interface for a tool. These are all difficult human tasks. But with Copilot and using agents and the LLMs that are available, these are very simple tasks. And what I do is I step through in this issue and I talk about fixing bugs that you're dealing with. You'll start the script, you'll try to get it to run, you'll run into an error. What does that error mean? If you know how to debug, great, but if you don't know how to debug, this will be a solution for you. Even if you know how to debug, you may not know how to fix the problem. LLMs will be able to fix the problem for you. So that's one area that's really awesome that you can use to sort of use these tools more often, right? A lot of times in the past for me, I stopped using a tool because I just couldn't get it to run. With this new capability in LLMs and getting everything into VS Code, I've actually been able to fix the bugs pretty easily and get the tool running. I talk about creating a user interface for a CLI tool, right? And in this case, I talk about Sherlock. Sherlock is one of these great username search tools, but they don't have a user interface. And using an LLM and kind of going back and forth with it for about 20, 30 minutes, I built a user interface for Sherlock. And now I can run it on my local computer, and anytime I want to do a username search, I can just run it. And the cool part about it is it's built right on top of the GitHub repository. So I just have to regularly update the repository and my user interface will be updated accordingly. So I talk a little bit about that. And finally, improving the documentation. As you run into issues, into problems, you can add documentation to actually make sure that no one else is running into that issue. So in the case that I talk about in this issue, I talk about DocsCord, which I mentioned in the last OSINT newsletter that went out. I believe it was issue number 83. And I ran into a lot of issues getting it started. And one of the main issues was that all of the instructions assumed that I was running off of Linux. I was actually running off of Mac OS. So I was able to update the documentation for me personally to make sure that all of the instructions were specifically for Mac OS instead of Linux. Another instance that I had another open source intelligence tool that I had built. I had it on the shelf. It's in the OSINT Newsletter GitHub collection, but it didn't really have any documentation other than what it was. So I used LLMs to be able to read the whole script and then update the README so that all the documentation is really easy to read and very useful. And so fixing bugs, improving documentation, adding user interfaces to a CLI tool to be able to use it in the browser. These are all things you can do with LLMs. I stepped through that step by step in this issue. Another thing that I talk about too is adding functionality to a tool. Let's say that Sherlock is awesome, but it's missing like 5 username searches that you really would like to see. And you're having to do those manually outside the tool. Well, you can very easily add those 4 or 5 different methods to the tool using AI. And then that way, every time you want to run a username search, you don't have to do those manual tasks anymore. You can have them integrated directly into the tool. And then once you add those capabilities to the tool, you'll be able to also see that in the user interface that you built. So in this issue, I sort of talk about like setting up in VS Code, getting Copilot all set up, making sure you subscribe to that. If you aren't familiar with that, go ahead and head on over to issue number 77, going back a little bit to August, osintnewsletter.com/77. That shows you how to get set up with VS Code, understand all of the different features that are available with Copilot, talk about how you can open a project in VS Code. And in this case, it's the tool that you download from GitHub. And then I step through every single iteration that I talk about, fixing the bugs, improving the documentation, adding functionality, adding a user interface. And the cool part about this is you can do this for pretty much every tool that you find. So if you really want to get involved in the OSINT community, you really want to contribute and add value to other people that are investigators, this is a great way to do it. I mentioned in the past that you can take a very simple process like taking a bunch of government records, building a database for all those records, and then putting a search user interface on top of it. That's a very basic example. This is another very cool way that you can contribute. You can continue to add modules to different tools like Blackbird, Sherlock, etc. Or you can just add user interfaces, because a lot of people are asking for those things. And if you're really, deciding that you want to be contributing a lot, you can maybe even host those applications online so that people don't even have to install them. They can just go directly to a URL and begin those searches automatically. So if this is something you're interested in, go ahead and upgrade your subscription. Head on over, again, OSINT Newsletter /85. Go through step by step. I don't actually provide the code for all of these. I'm actually going to be publishing some of this, maybe fork the repositories and publish my own versions. Maybe I'll talk with the admins of some of these people to see if they want to merge this stuff in. But it kind of shows you the thought process behind what I'm trying to do and how you can go and do it yourself step by step. So again, thanks for listening. That's it for this episode of the OSINT Podcast. Again, make sure that you're subscribing on social media. We don't often post a lot of updates via email. We usually just like to put out the content via email. Anything else that's related to the publication, whether it's the newsletter or the podcast, you want to catch us on social media. So the 2 main areas are going to be X and LinkedIn. But the areas that we're going to be focusing on here pretty soon is within Substack Notes. So if you subscribe here on Substack and you have the Substack app, you should also be able to see notes coming up here pretty soon that talk about more details and specifics about the content that's covered in this podcast. So again, thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever, and stay tuned for the next episode, which should be coming out in about 2 weeks.